Now I have to add the second Ansible rollback so we can install Docker. Then I will use the apt cache manage on Docker CE command and also the awk command, but now I will have a much more complicated regular expression. Requiring sudo can be annoying because sometimes you will forget about using the sudo command and you will get an error message. So if you want to have a more comfortable solution, then you can create a wrapper script, and that is what I will do now. So I can choose an application which I want to install, or I can search for a specific application like file browser. My container is running and healthy. Create a folder and create a file, for example, readme md, and edit a readme file. Let's do something interesting today. I guess many of you already read the blog post about the topic I will talk about, but maybe some of you prefer watching video and listening instead of reading a blog post. So here I am, and what you will have at the end of this video is a single Ansible playbook which you can use to create a virtual machine and install immediately something inside the VM. We will install some command line tools using the same Ansible role which we created before, and we'll also install Docker and Portainer in the VM. Portainer is basically a web-based graphical interface for your containers, which I will talk about later in more details. This is the changed source code, and you can see I changed many files here. The playbook which I will talk about today is the playbook LXD Docker VM, but other playbooks changed as well. So before we can start to talk about how we can install Docker and Portainer in the virtual machine, let's see how I improved the previous playbooks and an Ansible role. The first changed playbook is the playbook LXD Docker VM, which we will change more later. I added this gather facts parameter and set it to false because I don't want Ansible to gather facts, device information from the remote server, so I can make my playbook faster. We used this parameter in the playbook system-based playbook, and I didn't add it to the other playbooks until now. And I added it to the LXD install and the LXD remove playbooks as well. I also changed the hosts parameter, which means that since I'm not using the special group called all anymore, I will not install LXD on all of my machines defined in my inventory file. If I go to my inventory example file, you can see how I added this new inventory group. The next change is in an Ansible role, but to understand that I will have to go back to the playbook LXD remove. So I have two Ansible roles here. LXD remove is the one that removed the LXD snap package, and the second is the ZFS destroy pool, which is to destroy the ZFS pool. And when I started to test the playbook and the Ansible roles, everything worked perfectly. But later I realized that sometimes the ZFS destroy pool couldn't work because after the LXD remove Ansible role, somehow the ZFS pool disappeared. It was not deleted, it was just disappeared, and I had to restart a systemd service called ZFS import cache. So I went to the Ansible role, ZFS destroy pool, and the tasks file here, and I used this built-in systemd module with the state restarted because I wanted to restart this service, and the name is what I already mentioned, ZFS import cache. And the next task will find the ZFS pool again. And now we can talk about the new playbook and the new play which we will add in the LXD Docker VM playbook. And I will close the other playbooks. We don't need any of those. You know the beginning of this playbook, and if I collapse it, you can see that I have a second play, but I also had to add a new task in the previous play. So I will use this built-in add host module to dynamically create a new inventory group and add the previously created virtual machine to this inventory group. So I don't have to manually change the inventory file. It has only two parameters. The first is groups, which is the list of groups to which we want to add the virtual machine, and the second is host name. And actually, the original name of this parameter is name, and host name is just an alias. And I thought that using this alias is a better idea. All of the other variables here are not parameters of the add-host Ansible module, but variables that you could use in the inventory file to make the SSH connection. So you know about the Ansible user, you know about the Ansible Bcampus, and you probably know about the Ansible SSH private key file. I think I mentioned at the beginning of this series. If not, then I mentioned this now. So you don't have to configure this parameter in your inventory file or in this task. You could just configure your SSH client. But since we are creating this inventory group dynamically, I wanted to include this parameter as well. And we have this VM SSH key variable. This is a config variable which we can find at the beginning of this playbook, and the original value is coming from a variable with the config prefix. And the last parameter is Ansible SSH host key checking. When you want to SSH to a remote server the first time, you are usually asked to accept the fingerprint of the server's SSH keys, and you don't want to do that when you are using a virtual machine which you create and delete and you recreate many times. So you can set this parameter to false, and that means that you will always trust this server. This task alone does nothing, so we have to have a play which will refer to this newly created inventory group. And this is the second play which we will create. And I also use this getFacts parameter again. We will have a pre-task section, and we will also have a roles section with the already mentioned CLI tools, Docker, and Portainer. But let's start with the pre-tasks. You probably remember that when we created the virtual machine, we had to wait for the IP address of the VM because we needed the IP address to configure the SSH client. But having the IP address doesn't mean that the SSH daemon is running inside the VM. So because we need the SSH connection for the play to run, we need to wait for the connection. And this is why we are using the built-in wait for connection Ansible module, and you can configure it to try the connection multiple times. Eventually it will connect, and then it will run the next task. And the next task is the update apt cache task, which uses the built-in apt module just to update the cache. We used this apt module before. And I needed this because when I first tried this playbook, then sometimes the CLI tools Ansible role failed, and when it failed, it always failed when it tried to install Python pip. And it can happen when the apt cache is not up to date. So instead of waiting for some automatic updating, I wanted to update this before I run the CLI tools Ansible role. Before we run the whole playbook, I want to run only the CLI tools. So I comment out the Docker and the Portainer roles so we can test if our dynamic inventory group works. And now in the terminal, first I will have to reinstall LXD install. I only had to run this playbook because previously I deleted my LXD server, so I had to reinstall this, but if you already had LXD, then you don't have to install it again. I can clear the screen and run the other playbook, LXD Docker VM. You can see that the CLI tools Ansible role actually ran, and now it's time to work with Docker. Now I have to add the second Ansible role back so we can install Docker. And it has a parameter docker sudo users, which I will talk about later. Let's go to the Ansible role. We will have default variables, tasks, and helper variables. If we check the helper variables, this is very similar to which we used when we installed YQ, which was to parse YAML files. And this is when we needed the Ansible fact, which we didn't collect at the beginning of the playbook, so we had to use a task. And if I scroll there, you can find this built-in setup module. This is how we gathered the distribution release information and the architecture information. But now let's talk about how we install Docker. I always say, and I mean it, that when you want to install something new, then you always start with the official documentation. So the tasks that you can see here are actually based on the official documentation, so let's go there. I will search for Docker install Ubuntu, and I will find the official installation guide. And if I scroll down, I will find how I can remove the previous packages. I don't want to implement that part. I just assume that if I had packages I had to remove, then I did it manually. So let's scroll down, and you can find the first command that we have to implement in Ansible. And this is it. We had to update the cache. We did that. We now have to install the CA certificates and curl. And if I go back, this is here. We use the built-in APT module. Then we had to create a new folder. This documentation is using the install command, but this is basically just creating a new folder with these permissions. So this is what I do here. I use the built-in file module, and I will set the same mode. So what's next? If I go back, I can find it is using curl, and then when it downloads the GPG key, then it will also set the permissions on that file. And I had to use the get URL built-in module to get the GPG key. The first parameter is the URL, and the second is the destination, and the third is the mode, the same mode that the documentation mentioned here using the chmod command. And the next part will generate the repository configuration, including the architecture and the GPG key, and we have a URL, and at the end we will need release code name. So we have the version code name environment variable after sourcing the ATC OS release. We will have the stable version, and then we will redirect the output to the docker.list repository configuration file under atc/apt/sources.list.d. Now that's what we have to do in Ansible. So let's go back. We will use the apt repository built-in module. The first parameter is file name, which is the file name without the extension. So we set it to Docker, and the extension will be added automatically. And the second parameter is repo, which is the line to generate into the configuration file. And we will get the architecture, which will come from the variable we set in the vars main YAML. And we will also have the GPG key, that is a static path, and we will have the URL, and then the release information also coming from the vars main YAML. It has to be present, of course, and we will want to update the cache because we changed the repository configuration, so we want to update the cache so we can use this new repository. Before we continue, I want to try it, so I will add the new task just to make sure that this Ansible role fails, and the message can be just test. Okay, so let's go back to the terminal and run playbook lxd docker VM. The playbook failed, but this time it was intentional. So let's go to the remote server and into the virtual machine. And let's use the command which was mentioned in the documentation, which was apt cache medicine docker CE. So this is the list of available versions, and we need to choose a version from this list. We have a version string, which is not just the version number of Docker CE, it also contains a number at the beginning, and there is a number after the version number of Docker CE and also the Ubuntu release number and the release code name. Sometimes the part before and after the Docker CE version number changes, so we will need to write a regular expression to parse this version string. Let's go back to the official documentation and scroll down. You can find how you can install the latest version or how you can install a specific version. And this is where the apt cache medicine command is mentioned. It also mentions the awk command, which can also use regular expressions, and that is what we will do. So let's go back to Ansible, and we have this new task, which will use the Ansible built-in shell module. Then I will use the apt cache medicine docker CE command and also the awk command, but now I will have a much more complicated regular expression. We will have a regular expression for the part before the docker CE version number. We will also have a regular expression for the part after the docker CE version number, and we will have the docker CE version number. We can use the docker version variable, but the default value contains placeholders. And we can replace this placeholder, this asterisk, with regular expression. So let's go back. So all of these placeholders will be replaced with this regular expression, and the dot character will be escaped. This can be used to install the latest version. On the other hand, if I replace one of these placeholders with an actual number, then I can, for example, install the latest version of Docker CE 25. Or if I know the minor version as well, then I can set this as well. If I just want to install the latest version, then I will use the default value. Let's go back to the tasks file. And now we can finally use the built-in apt module again to install the components of Docker CE. And since we finally have a version number as well, which is coming from the first line of the result of the previous command, we can use this full version variable to install the same version of the Docker C, Docker C CLI, and the Docker C rootless extras. And I also use and install the container.io, Docker buildx plugin, and Docker compose plugin. After I install all of these, I want to make sure that if I run apt upgrade on the remote server inside the virtual machine, I don't want to upgrade Docker C. If I do that, then it can break something, and I obviously don't want to do that. So I will use the built-in command module to run apt mark hold, and the parameters are the packages that I don't want to update automatically. I don't want to update Docker C, the CLI, and I don't want to update the rootless extras. I don't want to update the containerd and the compose plugin. So almost all of the packages are listed here. The only package I didn't hold is the Docker buildx plugin. The next part is something that you will not find in the documentation, but before I run it, I want to add the fail task again and install Docker CE. Okay, let's go back to the previous terminal. I will clear the screen and run playbook lxd docker VM. And now we have Docker inside the virtual machine. It's time to try. But this time I will use SSH to log in to the virtual machine, Docker lxd, and my host name, which will be different for you. And now I'm in as a manager user. And if I want to use Docker info, it will show me an error message. I don't have access to the Docker socket. Let's check the file. And you can see that the owner of the file is the root user and also the Docker group, which means that you can either be a root user or be in the Docker group. When you are using the sudo command, then you can run something as root, so running sudo docker info will give us a response. And the point is that when you are using the sudo command, then the command is logged. So if I check the logs in var log out.log, then I can see that it logged that I used less. It also logged that I used the docker info command here. Requiring sudo can be annoying because sometimes you will forget about using the sudo command and you will get an error message. So if you want to have a more comfortable solution, then you can create a wrapper script, and that is what I will do now. In Ansible, I already have this file, so all I have to do is copy this out and create the file. Sudo nano user local bin docker. And of course I have to remove the spaces and make the file executable. Now if I run docker info, I get the response. It didn't ask for a password because I have already given that password before, but sometimes it does. So if you don't want to be asked for a password when you are using the docker command, then you can add a new sudo as role. So let's do that. We can go back to the Ansible role, and the last Ansible task is the one that will create the new sudoers rule. We can use the built-in copy module, and you can use the content parameter to define a string which will be copied into the file. So what this file does, it will allow any user who is in the Docker sudo group to run the previously created wrapper script without being asked for a password. So first we need to create this Docker sudo group, which will happen here. And I can remove this fail task. And the next is creating the Docker sudo group using the built-in group module. And the next, we can check if the users exist, all the users I defined in the Docker sudo users variable. And the next task will use the built-in user module to add all the defined users in the Docker sudo users list to the Docker sudo group. And since I'm using the append true parameter, it means that the Docker sudo group will not replace all the existing groups. It will be appended to the list of existing groups. Let's just go back to the playbook where you can see I'm using this Docker sudo users parameter, and the value of this will come from this much longer variable. If I go to the inventory file, you can see how I define this parameter, and the only value of this list will be the manager user. So I basically give Docker access to the manager user. Of course, the manager user can become root, so it can use any other command, including Docker, but at least it will be not asked for a password, and you can add any other users to this list. And now we have to run the playbook. So go back to the terminal and run playbook lxd docker VM. Now I can even use Visual Studio Code to access the remote virtual machine and open a project on the remote machine. Open a folder. It can be my home. And now I will trust the authors, and then I will install the Docker extension. After installing it, I will have this Docker logo. I can click on it and see the list of images. I don't have any images yet. Now I can go back to my terminal, to the remote machine, and check the logs. Now I have to move my face away so you can see that Visual Studio Code actually used this docker image ls command to list the images. It didn't find anything, but it tried to list the images. So even if someone uses Visual Studio Code, everything will be logged. And just because we are forcing the users to use the sudo command. And now it's time to install Portainer. I go back to my host and also Ansible and the playbook. So let's remove this comment and open the Portainer role. Again, we will have default variables and tasks. But this Portainer role will be a much easier role. It will just install the Docker Python package, and it is required to use the Docker container module. This is now not a built-in module, this is part of the community Docker collection. We don't want to use any default parameters, so we set the container default behavior to no defaults. We want the container to be started, so we set the state to started. We also set the image, which is coming from the parameter. And we also have this restart policy. We set it to always, which means if we reboot our machine, then Portainer will start again. Then we set the port forwarding. The source port will come from the parameter. And we set the volumes. We also mount the Docker sockets so Portainer can manage the Docker containers. Now we can check the default. And the container name will come from the Portainer name variable. The default container name is Portainer. We will have an image, and we will use a specific version number. And the source port will be the same as the destination port by default, and we will have a volume for the data of Portainer, and the name of the volume will start with the container name. So that's it. And if we go back to the playbook, you can see that I'm not using any parameter to override the default. So now let's go back to the terminal and install Portainer. Now we know that Portainer is installed on the remote server inside the virtual machine, but we still have to access it. And since the virtual machine is not on our LAN network, we have to use SSH tunnels. So I will clear my screen and I will use this SSH tunnel. So I can forward my local port to the Portainer port in the virtual machine using the loopback IP address, and I will have an additional port forwarding so I can add another application in the Portainer. And my hostname is docker.lxd. And the hostname of my host machine on which my virtual machine is. If I run this and go to my web browser, and go to Advanced to accept the TLS certificate, then now I can set my password. Then I confirm it. And I don't want to allow collecting anonymous statistics, so I want to disable it. Then I can click on Create User. And now I have Portainer installed. I can go to Get Started. Then I can choose the local environment and go to Templates. So I can choose an application which I want to install, or I can search for a specific application like file browser. I choose this one, set a name, and then go down to show advanced options to set a port number, and I set 8000. So scroll down and click on deploy container. Now I have to wait and sometimes click on refresh page to see that my container is running and healthy, and open another tab and go to localhost 8000. This is my file browser, and I can pass admin, admin, create a folder and create a file, for example, readme md, and edit a readme file. Okay, so I can save this by pressing Ctrl S or clicking on this icon on the top right corner. And then close it, and I have a file. And now finally we have a playbook which we can use to create a virtual machine and also immediately install Docker and Portainer inside that virtual machine. So you can have a web-based graphical interface for your containers. You can also use templates to run applications, and you can use SSH tunnels to have access to the remote applications on the virtual machine. So using Portainer can be useful if you want to learn about containers, click on buttons, start new applications from templates. Maybe you want to check the logs, browse existing containers. On the other hand, if you want to run a production system, you really want to be able to reproduce what you have done before. So if you have compose files in Portainer, or if you just clicked on buttons to start new applications from templates without having any local compose files, then you have no way to reproduce what you have done. If anything happens with Portainer, you have no access to your files. That's why I don't recommend using Portainer in production, at least for creating containers. But if you have a different opinion, please share in the comment section.